Okay, so now that we've looked at nisai, what we're going to do now is to look and assess these tosai to try and identify the same characteristics that you've seen with the bigger fish. Now, the thing to bear in mind with these fish is that being tosai, you'll still see the same differences and qualities and things like that, but they'll be a little bit more incremental because, if you like, everything is scaled down to a smaller size, so it's kind of harder to identify the differences between the fish. But the thing to remember is that when you look at these fish, if you were to then grow the fish on for a year or so, the bigger the fish get, the more that those small differences between the fish become a much wider margin as the fish grows. So what seems like a very small difference on one of these tosai now, when that fish grows up into being a jumbo fish, it's like two different roads. One's going to go and become something great, and one that maybe perhaps just a little bit less desirable will go down a completely different road whereby perhaps it might not even become good at all. Now, these fish are all actually from very similar bloodlines, different breeders, but the lineage of these tends to have somewhat similar traits, really because these are bloodlines that I actually favour myself. Now, one thing that you really need to understand as far as bloodlines are concerned really are the colour traits and body types and things like that. So it's quite important really to understand the parents of the fish that you're looking at to try and get some reasonable judgment on what kind of body type the fish is likely to carry or should carry, and what kind of colour type it's going to have as well. Because if you imagine buying fish from a bloodline or parent set that genetically will predominantly produce very good fish but with a redder kind of colour type, and yet the fish you're looking at is particularly orange, then there's a chance that maybe that fish won't actually peak and become something really beautiful that resembles its particular lineage. And likewise, if you buy a fish that maybe is of a very soft colour for its bloodline, and then you're looking at an individual fish that's actually very red, then the chances are that that's actually a fish that won't last very well. So it will maybe within a year or two peak and finish and then start going downhill again. And these kind of koi are ones that really don't make the grade as jumbo koi. So it is very, very important to understand some background of the fish you're looking at. Looking at these fish, you'll notice that there's actually two fish that are significantly smaller than the others in the bowl. And the reason really for this is that those fish are fish that, if you like, haven't really made the grade as far as growth and quality goes. So they're fish that are smaller for a reason, and more often than not the reason that they're smaller is because the frames are weaker and that kind of thing. So because of the frame being weaker, the fish isn't really capable of growing jumbo. So it's important really to know that the size of the fish that you're choosing with a view to growing jumbo are actually of an optimal size, if you like, because if you've got something that's got a weak frame, it will grow a lot slower and won't become jumbo in the long run. So now we'll just take a look at these two fish in the bowl and compare the differences between them. Now, if you look at the larger two-step kohaku here, what you'll see is that the colour on the fish is very thick and very glossy. And then if you also look to the skin of the fish, that is also very bright and white and glossy. And then if you look at the smaller sibling, bearing in mind it's from the same breeding, what you'll see is that the colour is a lot flatter in its appearance without so much shine and a little bit translucent. And bearing this in mind, if you then look at the white skin of the fish, you'll also see that that carries the same kind of look to it, of being somewhat translucent without so much shine. It is, however, important to realise as well that when fish are smaller, the skin and colour is also a little bit thinner. So it does make it a little bit trickier, the fact that the fish are of a different size, but nonetheless, this smaller fish is the same age, so I would expect the colour to be a little bit more similar to its larger sibling. If it was actually a younger fish, then you could explain it really just with age.
To me, the colour looks a little sort of flat on that one compared to this one. Is that something to do with the quality of it as well? This coil's got a kind of gloss effect to it, whereas this one's kind of dull.
That's right, Greg. What you're seeing here is really the thickness of the skin on this fish is much thicker and shinier, whereas the smaller fish is kind of flatter and thinner in its colour appearance. It lacks in shine and has the same look carried over to the colour. So it also doesn't look so solid and not as shiny, and therefore not as thick. So you're right in what you're saying. But as we were saying also, the body type you've got on the one fish is significantly bigger than the other, yet they've been raised together, and ultimately the smaller one has been selected out because the breeders felt that although the fish is reasonably good for what it is, it's not really something that's for them a good prospect to keep as tattoo and grow through to nisai. So it's a fish effectively that's sold off, whereas the other one is one which a breeder ideally would have kept in them up on through until nisai. Now if we look at another example, looking at this fish you can see that the pattern is very busy and therefore has a lot of kiwa and also a lot of sashi, which is inevitable with a busy pattern. If you've got a simple pattern like the two-step, then you've not got so many scales of kiwa and therefore it's easier to get it right. And likewise, as far as sashi is concerned, the sashi is also easier to get right just purely because there's less of it within the pattern. The more complicated the pattern is, the harder it is to get a fish that's got perfect sashi and kiwa. Now, this one you'll see all the way through the sashi is a little bit too deep and a little bit too uneven, so really this fish is something of a risky prospect to grow big and become good. I mean, maybe there's a chance that the fish will grow up and turn out really good, but this kind of risk has to be reflected in the price of the fish, because the higher the risk is, then really the more stacked the odds are against the fish really being worthless as a bigger fish. So I'm not saying that what you should be buying is a fish that's finished, or a fish that is more finished should be more expensive. What I'm saying is a fish with really high quality and very consistent sashi and good kiwa and so on is going to be a lot more predictable. So its future being more certain is going to basically result in you paying more money for it.
With this one, there's some colour here where you can see some differences in the scales. You can see a sort of darker centre. What will happen with that?
What you'll find is that quite often that the base of the scale will tend to be a lot darker edge than the outer edge of the scale. And this is really because of the start of the fukarin creeping onto the scale. So you get kind of like a darker line, but it's really lack of colour development as well because the fish is growing so quickly. So what happens is that when this fish gets bigger, the colour also gets thicker, the scales get thicker. So you end up with something that as the fish grows bigger, it will become a lot more solid and a lot more reflective in its qualities, and therefore a lot more even across the scales. So it's really no problem at all to see this kind of look to the colour.
So it's something that you would think would even out?
To be fair, Greg, it would do. But for me personally, I don't really pay too much attention to this look within the colour of the fish. What matters more to me is the actual quality of the colour itself, not whether the colour very clearly shows each scale individually or whether it's actually thicker across all of the scales.
Sorry to keep going on about this one, Mike. It has different types of kiwa. Some of it cuts across the scale, some of it curves around. Kamisaura and Marizomi. How do you expect these to develop over time, given it's quite a complicated fish with a lot going on?
What I tend to like with this kind of fish, and again it does depend on bloodlines, is that a lot of fish nowadays really are bred so that the breeders are producing fish with more Marizomi kiwa because Marizomi kiwa is very attractive. But I tend to like fish that have a little bit of straight cut kiwa as well. So let's say for the best part that perhaps 80% of that kiwa is Marizomi and maybe 20% of it is straight cut kiwa cutting across the scale. This is regarded something that is, if you like, inherently genetically very stable. So therefore in my mind I think it's a very good prospect for the future by having this kind of two types of kiwa. If you've got Marizomi on each and every scale, let's say perfect Marizomi, throughout the pattern, what you'll generally find is that as the fish grows it doesn't tend to last so long. So maybe when the fish gets to 3 or 4 years old you can quite often find that the kiwa in some cases will start to kind of break away a little bit and starts losing colour easily. But when you've got a little bit of this Kamisori kiwa, what you'll tend to find is as that fish gets bigger, you'll find that it will just hold its kiwa really well.
When you say break away, I take it you mean get the odd stray scale coming off the back of the pattern?
Yes, you'll start getting the early signs as the kiwa starts getting a little bit exaggerated. And then what happens is that you'll get almost kind of like a rosy sort of petal kind of look to it. And then eventually the scales will just kind of peel away one by one. They'll just peel away from the back of the pattern, and that's where you start really losing all the colour. So now we'll take a look at two different fish, which I think reflect what I'm saying about the kiwa, because these two have that kind of mix of kiwa that I tend to favour. Now, these two fish are actually from two different breeders. The bloodlines aren't really dissimilar, but what you'll see on this particular fish is that this one actually is very, very much of a sensuke kind of look to it. The colour is very much like sensuke, and you'll see there's also quite a lot of straight cut kiwa, which is more often than not associated with sensuke. And I don't mind straight cut kiwa, but it's got to be, if it is straight cut, it's got to be very, very nice. It's got to be very, very sharp, and this fish is particularly good in that regard. If you've got Kamisori kiwa or straight cut kiwa that is very much kind of blurred and soft in its appearance, then it's actually a pretty strong indication that the quality of the fish is actually very low. Now, if you look at this fish in this area here, you'll see that looking further down the sides of the fish here, that the kiwa is actually mostly Marizomi and extremely attractive from scale to scale. And this area also has really nice Marizomi kiwa. Looking at the shoulder area here, you'll see that the kiwa is actually mostly Kamisori, but although it's Kamisori, it's absolutely razor sharp. And this kind of kiwa really with this kind of colour, which is particularly thick and soft and very, very shiny, is extremely good for the future. Now looking at this fish, you'll see that the shoulder area, although it's predominantly Marizomi kiwa, you'll see it's got some scales are actually straight cut as well. And this kind of kiwa, coupled again with particularly thick shiny colour that this fish has got, is a very, very good combination. This is also extremely good for the future.
On both of these fish, the Kamisori kiwa is across the ridge line of the dorsal. Is that quite a common thing, that if you're going to get it, you're going to get it there and the Marizomi will be lower down the fish?
It will tend to be, but what will happen, and this again depends on bloodlines, is that if you've got a very, very red colour, then you'll find that the colour is actually harder to keep. It won't last so long and it will tend to slowly deteriorate when the fish gets older. Whereas if you've got a softer colour, what tends to be the case with that is it's kind of a little bit like weeds within a garden, whereby the soft colour wants to try and take over the garden, whereas the beautiful, more colourful red kind of colour is a little bit like a delicate flower, and therefore it's a lot more difficult to take care of and keep alive. So what you'll find that is that if you've got a very soft colour like this fish, and you've got this Kamisori kiwa on the shoulder, what will generally happen in my experience is that the kiwa slowly will tend to creep backwards within the scale itself. So as the fish gets older, it will quite commonly creep and become Marizomi on one or two scales later on. Now, where it most commonly creeps is into the fukarin. So what you'll find with fish like this is that maybe when they are young, they've got Marizomi kiwa like this on the shoulder, but what you'll find is that as they grow up, the colour will creep into the fukarin and almost creates like a shortcut effect between the scales. So instead of going from one scale to the next one, from as Marizomi if you like, what you tend to find is that it will go Marizomi around the scale and then just cut across the fukarin to the next scale of Marizomi. And this is quite common to see.
So you mean creep and fill in the whole scale to form Marizomi, with the colour then creeping through the fukarin just to soften it up a little bit?
Yeah, that's right. That's what you'll generally find. Now, one of the things that's really most important is the body type. And one thing that you'll see with both of these is that they've both got very nice backbones. Now, they're actually from different bloodlines, and this one, the body is really nice and long, and the backbone has got decent height to it, and it's also very thick on the backbone.
When you say decent height, Mike, can you just explain what you mean by that? Do you mean the actual height of the whole fish, or the climb up the fish?
Yes, not so much the whole height of the fish. It's actually possible to have a fish that is too high in its body. And what you'll get is a fish that is so high it almost looks like it's too short in the body. So although you want a nice even kind of incline, if you like, over the back of the fish, you don't want it to be too high. But you want it to be a decent height nonetheless. And with any luck, with a small fish that's going to put on a big body, you need a kind of strength to the backbone, almost as though it's kind of hollowed out either side of the backbone.
So almost a concave type look to it. So you get a very prominent ridge and the flesh hollowed out either side. And what does that indicate?
Well, we'll put this one back in the bowl again as a point of comparison to that. Now, what you'll see here is that the body profile of the fish is a lot smaller, but the profile is a lot more rounded over the top of the fish. And this ultimately is a fish that hasn't been grown so big because the body type it's got, because of its backbone strength, is not as strong as the bigger fish.
So you're saying that this backbone is less capable of carrying volume in future life?
Yes, the body type itself is less capable of carrying any shape later on, and perhaps more so it's less likely to grow big. You haven't got the same kind as this one where the height of the fish comes up slowly to a peak, whereas this one rounds over and really doesn't peak so much.
Okay.
And likewise, although you can see that this one looks as though the backbone is giving you an indication that maybe the fish can put on a bit more weight later on, this one on the other hand is a lot stronger in that regard. So hopefully, as a jumbo fish, this will become very, very big and very big bodied with any luck. What you can find sometimes is that, although it's more of an issue with Sankey, the body kind of lacks height, but also the head lacks height. So if you look at the body type on its own, the backbone may look good, but you'll find in actual fact the head height is lacking perhaps, and that kind of almost creates an effect whereby coming over the back of the head it kind of runs shallow, and then the body, although it's got reasonably good height, it almost looks as though the head has got a neck, if you like, to it because of that lack of height within the head profile. Now with this fish, I think it's extremely good as an overall package. The colour is a little redder than the other ones, and the kiwa is very nice, but the sashi on this is really its strongest point. The sashi, although it appears a little bit deep, it's actually very, very even, and the front edge of the sashi blends away to nothing.
Is the reason it's quite prominent due to the colour type of the fish? Because the red is very red, it's showing through the white?
It is, exactly right. The light penetrates through the white scales and actually picks up the colour of the scales underneath, and that kind of reflects back up. And so that's what you see. It's the colour intensity as much as anything, but nonetheless the sashi all the way across is extremely consistent all the way through. So this kind of fish, when it grows up, this sashi is very, very easy to tighten up and become really nice. The body type is also very good. It may not be the best body in the whole vat, as it were, but this kind of fish is still, I think, very easy to grow jumbo.
When you're mentioning body type and you're out in Japan and choosing fish, do you have a sort of selection criteria? You hear these things, oh, the fish has got a big mouth, it's got a long head, it's got a wide head, there's a ratio between the back of the head and the front of the dorsal length. Do you work off that sort of criteria when choosing the fish, or do you subconsciously do it, or have a checklist of criteria to do?
For me personally, not really. It is generally believed that the dorsal should start literally halfway down the length of the fish, which obviously it does in this case. So yes, that's a good point, but quite often if you look at a fish you'll see that maybe the tail tube is a little bit shorter, which gives you the impression of the tail tube actually being thicker, which is actually in a way a bit of a problem, because if you imagine sawing off the tail and then sawing off part of the tail tube and then joining the tail back on a little bit further forward, it kind of gives you the impression that, oh yeah, the tail tube's really thick. But in reality, that's not the case. The tail tube is actually just a little bit short.
So you're actually saying it's more of a deformity in some cases?
In a way it is. If you're looking at fish from the same parents, you are better off choosing the one with perhaps a longer tail tube. But sometimes some parent fish just produce offspring that have a shorter tail tube than other parent fish. So if you like, it's kind of a genetic thing, but it doesn't necessarily reflect on how big the fish is going to get.
Whilst we're talking about different bloodlines and different parents, there is something else that you often come across when it comes to body, where you get a shallow head and a big hump at the back of it on the shoulders. I know that some people think this is good for growing koi to jumbo, and others say this is bad for growing koi jumbo. Would you say that this is more of a bloodline thing? It can vary, or is it a hard and fast rule?
I think it's a bloodline thing, really. Some bloodlines, what I think actually causes that, and I assume what you're referring to is where you get to the back of the head, and then as soon as it hits the scales, there's a sudden jump.
Yes, that's exactly what I'm talking about.
What that generally speaking is, with certain bloodlines, and it's not really an issue, it's just really the way that the bloodline is. The body type, if you like, where it goes over the head, you get towards the back of the head, and rather than gently rising onto the body and continuing on, what you actually get is a head levelling out a little bit, and then once it hits the body, it's almost as though it's got no option than to step up slightly. And it's not really an issue at all. It's something that you'll see with certain breeders' fish. And I think for the best part, when you see those breeders' fish grow at jumbo, it actually becomes less prominent. What you will tend to find sometimes, I think, that with some fish grown in the UK, for example, is that if fish are perhaps a little bit overfed, you'll get a little ridge that actually becomes more of a ridge as the fish grows up because the fish is getting too fat in that area.
So the fish is getting too fat and too shouldery, so that makes the head look too small? So it's more of a keeping issue than a fish issue?
Yes, it's a keeping issue rather than an issue with the fish itself. If it's kept in good water and grown reasonably quickly in ideal conditions, you should find that the fish won't put on any excessive weight in any particular area, such as the shoulder, for example. So therefore it won't get too beefy in its appearance.
Can exercise help with the current in the pond?
That I'm not so convinced of. I think the exercise tones the body up generally speaking, but doesn't necessarily stop the koi from becoming too fat. I think koi that become too fat are either fish that are perhaps raised in the wrong kind of environment, let's say too low a temperature and too much food, or they become too fat because the body type of the fish in question is just not really so good to begin with. So, anyway, if we have a look at another one. Now, this fish, and this is where it's also important to see fish with its siblings. If you take this fish on face value, you might look at the fish and say, okay, this fish is maybe 36 cm long, and you might regard that as being a pretty big jumbo tosai. And in all fairness, there's nothing wrong with the fish. The colour quality is pretty good, the colour is nice, sashi is nice. The fish is actually very, very good, but it's not an expensive fish. When that actually comes to light is when you put a much more expensive fish or higher level sibling in a bowl. Let's say this two-step. On face value, the one that's already in the bowl looks like a good fish until we put it next to another fish that's, let's say, the same age, same breeding, but significantly better with a much stronger body type. And then you start to realise that this one isn't really capable of so much. The fish is actually very good, but it's important to remember that it's a good fish at the given price. So what I'm saying is that if this fish, let's say, was something that was being represented and sold for several thousands of pounds, if you only see this particular fish from a particular breeder at this particular size, it's not really so much relevant. So when you say that, or when you're introduced to a bigger, much higher level fish from the same breeder, it becomes a lot more apparent that the smaller fish is perhaps a little bit overpriced. So it's important, really, if you're buying fish, to particularly young fish to grow big, to get some kind of benchmark to how big those koi should be, or how good a quality they should be. And then you have a benchmark to refer to with the other fish that you're looking to buy. So I think this is actually quite important.
The two whites on these koi seem dramatically different. This is a sort of brighter white. Is that a condition thing? And how do you take that into account when choosing fish? Is it easy to overlook good fish because of condition?
To me, the skin quality between these two fish doesn't really look so different. I can see what you're saying, and I think this is largely down to how the breeders are raising the fish. Let's say, for example, that you have a fish that's been selected out and put to one side and not fed so much for a few weeks, and yet another fish has been fed right up until the last moment with high protein food that's perhaps got a reasonably high colour content as well. You'll tend to find that the skin condition won't be so shiny, it might be a little bit kind of muddy looking. So, I mean, it's a good point you raise with this. I quite often hear people talk about the colour on the face of a fish, but really, personally, I think this is of very little relevance. What you really tend to need to look at is the colour on the body. The skin on the body of the koi, how thick it is, how shiny it is, because quite often you'll find that the facial areas of the fish, when they're being fed at higher temperatures and heavier feeding and so on, it's very easy for the facial area to discolour, and this is really it's a condition issue, and condition issues are very easy to rectify, whereas quality issues aren't. So, although you might criticise a fish thinking that the skin quality is not so good because it's not so white, it's something that really you can change very, very quickly by trying to stop feeding or lower the temperature, that kind of thing. Pretty much as we covered with the nisai earlier on. Now, this fish is something of a long shot. I think the overall colour quality of the fish is very good, the body type is very good, and the pattern's very good also. But what you're seeing on this fish is that the colour along the flanks of the fish appears to be a little bit weaker. When the fish bends and moves a little bit, it's almost as though it's starting to show fainter colour, or to a degree, slight areas of white between the scales.
You say this is a risky fish, but how do you tell the difference whether the colour is going to break or whether the colour will thicken as the fish gets older and fill in? And what you'll end up with is something that could turn out very well for you. Is it just a case of buying fish and learning?
It is, Greg. I think if you're buying lots of smaller fish, you'll very quickly get a feel for what will be okay and what won't be okay. Now, this fish, although the colour looks a little bit weaker along the sides, the overall colour of the fish is relatively soft and is actually quite a good representation of the colour of this particular bloodline. So I think with any luck and very, very good water, the colour along the flanks of the fish will actually become thicker in the future and really get a lot better. What you'll also see with this fish is that the kiwa is not so good as the other koi we've had in the bowl. There's a lot more blurred kiwa on this fish, and although that's a risk element, I think if it reflects in the price, it's actually worth gambling on this, because I think this type of fish, if you keep it very well, is actually very, very easy for this kind of koi to become a lot better later on, because the sashi is good, the body type is extremely good, the skin is good, and the pattern is very good as well. Most of the kiwa on the whole is good, but some of the kiwa is actually a little bit unfinished. So hopefully with good keeping skills, plenty of light and so on, you'll find that the colour areas on the flank will fill in and become much more solid later on. And the kiwa hopefully will also fill in. And the colour, I think, will just become thicker and much more beautiful later on. From a breeder's perspective, I think that this is actually a very, very good fish for them to keep in them up on this tatigoi and take a chance on, because I think as nisai, this could be something that a breeder could ask an awful lot more money for. Whereas from a hobbyist perspective, I think it's a particularly good fish if you can buy it for the right price. It's certainly not something I think that you could spend a lot of money on, because there is a large element of gamble with this fish, but I think it could pay off.
This fish, to me, the body type looks a little slender. You often hear people instantly go, male. I know that you think of body types being slender and being able to develop as the fish grows and put volume on later. Can you talk a bit about how you think this sort of body type develops over time, and perhaps people miss a good potential fish due to writing off a stereotypical body type?
That's a good question. I think at this age, it's impossible to judge the sex by whether the fish is fat or thin. And even getting the sex right by things such as checking the pectoral fins, the face, the vent, can be a little bit difficult. Colour condition and skin condition can also be a bit of an indication of what the sex is, but there's still a bit of element of gamble to that. Now, the body of the fish is a little thin, but it's important to remember in this fish's case that the fish is still in quarantine and has been through various chemical treatments, so she's not had so much food and therefore is not in such a good condition. But I think in a month or two's time, if you came back, you'd see a much better built fish. Sure, the body of the fish doesn't have so much height as one or two of the others we had in the bowl, but the height is still good. It's not so much of a sure thing perhaps as a few of the others, but the height of the body is pretty good, the backbone is reasonably good, but as you were saying earlier, we've not got this kind of concave look to the body type on the backbone on this fish, but it's not inferior either, so with a little luck later on, I think this koi will become good. But there is an element of chance, and it all comes down to the price really, because if you can get it for the right kind of price, then it's certainly worth that chance.
Me as a hobbyist looking at fish and buying young fish, there have obviously got to be sacrifices made for budget. Where would you start sacrificing? Would pattern be the first thing to go?
Pattern every time for me.
And then you'd step back, so what would be the first thing when buying a young fish it would have to have?
For me, it really comes down to, well, the body type is the most important thing if you want a fish to get big, but also if you want the fish to be good when it's big, then of course you need to have good colour, good sashi, good kiwa. They're also very important. If the kiwa's no good, then that fish is never really going to get any refinement to it anyway. And likewise, if the sashi is too uneven and too deep, then the chance of that sashi becoming beautiful later on is virtually nothing. So that side of it is quite important, and obviously colour quality in itself is also important, because there's no point in buying a fish that's got, say, very red colour, because if it's too red or too hard or maybe too thin, then it lacks elasticity and it's not going to last as the fish grows up anyway. So every single time I would take a pattern that was perhaps a little bit less desirable or a bit quirky, if I thought that the fish had the right kind of body and the right kind of qualities for me to try and grow up to become a really good jumbo fish.
One of the things that you didn't mention was skin. How does that fit in with colour, condition and your selections of fish?
Skin will quite often, you can kind of look to the colour of the fish to try and get an idea of how good the skin is. So likewise you can look at the skin to see how good the colour is. As I said earlier, if the skin is kind of transparent and translucent, that's also reflected in the colour looking the same way. So quite often if you've got any doubts about the skin of the fish, as to whether it's any good or not, you can actually look to the colour, and the colour will tell you if the skin is any good, because the colour is essentially sitting on top of the foundation, that foundation obviously being the white skin of the fish.
So you're saying if the fish has good depth of colour, it has a shine and a sheen to it, then that's an indication that the fish has quality skin as well?
Yes, in reality, if you're looking at a fish where you have some doubt over the skin not being so good, or you aren't so sure if it's a condition or quality issue, you can look to the colour. If the colour is very thick, very solid, very shiny, then the chances are that the skin issue that you're looking at or unsure about is actually just a condition issue as opposed to being a quality issue. Now, realistically, based on everything that we've talked about with these fish, if you wanted something or to buy a fish on a budget, obviously the two smallest fish are the cheapest fish, but there is one other here that is much cheaper than the others, and that is actually this one. Now, if I was personally looking for a fish and wanted to grow the fish big but didn't have the money, then this is a kind of fish that I would buy, because the base quality is fantastic. The colour is really as good as anything else in the bowl. The pattern is not so good, but the backbone is very good on this fish, and sure, it's a little bit skinny right now, but the height of the fish is good, the backbone is good, the head is good, and granted, perhaps the pattern's a little bit bald, but I think later on in life, I think this is something that it's got everything that you want quality-wise, so it's an easy fish to grow jumbo, perhaps to say maybe 90 cm, and you'll get away with it and you'll be able to admire the fish nonetheless. If you look at this one, which I think is really one of the best two prospects in here, if we look at this fish, a lot of people will look at it and say, oh, the pattern doesn't wrap deep enough, it doesn't go far enough down the lateral line. And I'd agree to a point. But what you'll see though is that as this fish grows to jumbo, yeah, the pattern is going to sit a little bit on top of the fish. But you'll get away with it if the fish is incredibly high quality with really good colour, really good kiwa, and really good skin, as well as obviously a fantastic body. Just think about the number of Grand Champion fish you've seen at All Japan level, whereby you'll see a fish with perhaps a somewhat sparse pattern. If you were to backtrack from that fish being a Grand Champion and look at the fish maybe when that was nisai, then I think a lot of people would look at it and say, oh, the pattern's no good. Yet when you see that fish as a Grand Champion, you think, wow.
Is that a question of, as a hobbyist, when looking at a young fish, people think pattern, 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 I've got to like it, etc. But as it gets bigger and all the other attributes overtake it, and pattern becomes irrelevant?
Absolutely. And this is why I say that this fish, it's less than half the price of this one. But if you grow it to jumbo, realistically you'll see the colour quality, the skin, the body type, with a bit of luck, will be so damn good that you'll look at it and say, yeah, the pattern's not amazing, but the fish is. And that's the point. So if you want to make sacrifices with a fish, the pattern has really got to be where you need to make it. Now if we look at all of the fish within this vat, in technical terms really, these four are the best ones. And you've got different styles of fish here. One fish is different breeder to the others, and this is very much sensuke as we said earlier. But I think this, the body type's really good, the colour and kiwa is really nice, and the sashi is really nice. So I think this is a particularly good fish for the future. The pattern's a little bit simple, a little bit bland right now, but as a big fish I think it's going to be very attractive. If you want something that's really safe, something that's easy to get big and very predictable, then this is going to be the one. The two-step. The colour on this fish I think is just fantastic. The kiwa is really nice also, and the sashi is really good all the way through the pattern. The body type, the backbone, the head shape, really everything on this fish is superb. If you want something that's got a good pattern, obviously you've got to pay a little bit more for it than the flowery one, but then I say a lot of people would look at this fish and then maybe think that the pattern's too sparse. But I think as a jumbo fish, I think this would look fantastic. Well, this kind of concludes where we are with this group of fish. So now we'll take a look at fish with another element. So let's take a look at showa.